Hello biology class. In this module 14 we'll be taking a close look at Kingdom Plantae, and we'll be covering pages 428 to 438 and the first 7 on your own questions. So let's look at some definitions. We begin with the study of botany. That's the study of plants. And by doing so, we break down plants into different categories. All right, we start with perennial plants. These are plants that continue to grow year after year. This includes woody plants, meaning a tree with trunk and bark, like this picture here, and some herbaceous plants, which we'll be talking about. Another category would be annual plants. These are plants that only live 1 year. Their whole life cycle is just 1 year. And this includes also some herbaceous plants. And biennial plants, those are plants that live for 2 years. And just to make a note, there are some herbaceous plants that are perennials. And however, we know that all woody plants would be perennials as well. All right, let's look a little more detail into the difference between woody and herbaceous plants. So woody plants have a trunk. The stem forms a new layer of woody tissue each year, increasing the diameter of the stem. And as we mentioned, all woody plants are perennials. Herbaceous plants, in contrast, have flexible stems. Their leaves and stems die down to the soil level at the end of every growing season, and they can be annual, biennial, or perennial. So a very typical example of a herbaceous plant would be daffodils, which thrive, during the spring and part of the summer, and then they die. And they have to grow from their bulb fresh each spring. Okay, so let's look at some organs in plants. We have 2 categories in the organs. We have the vegetative and the reproductive plant organs. So the vegetative organs would be the part of a plant which would include the roots, the stems, and the leaves. They are not involved in reproductions, and they are involved, however, in supporting the plant, synthesizing food, and delivering the food to different parts of the plant. So then another part of the plant, the reproductive organs, includes things like flowers, fruits, and seeds that are involved with reproduction. So now we have the classification of different parts of a plant, either being a fruit or a vegetable. So even though we think of a tomato, for example, oftentimes if in a food group you think of it being a vegetable, because it has seeds, it is actually considered a fruit, because it's also part of the reproductive organs of a plant. Some tricky fruits are things like peas and corn, because those are actually seeds, and those are actually considered fruits. Now, more commonly, you think of vegetables, carrots, which is part of the root, or lettuce, part of the leaves, or celery as part of the stems. Notice these vegetables are all in the category of the vegetative organs. So let's look at some specific plant tissues. We have what's called the meristematic tissue. It's sort of like the stem cells equivalent of a plant. It's undifferentiated cells. They are not specialized, but they have the potential to develop into other tissue, and mitosis occurs in meristematic tissue. Then you have what's called the ground tissue. It's the most common tissue in plants. It provides storage for starches and oils and may be involved in metabolism like photosynthesis and also in plant support. Then you have the dermal tissue. It shields the plant from pathogens like bacteria or fungi on the outside of a plant. It stops chemicals that are important for staying inside the plant from leaking out, and it also helps absorb water and minerals. And then finally you have what's called the vascular tissue, which is present in most plants, although not all. It carries water and other dissolved materials throughout the plant, so it's similar to blood vessels. It makes up the veins and leaves, just like the veins, for example, are in our limbs. So the two different types of vascular tissue would be the xylem and the phloem. Now, the xylem is actually a non-living vascular tissue, and it carries water and dissolved minerals from the roots of the plant, so from these roots, to its leaves. And when I was in biology class in high school, my teacher told me this little rhyme. It says "Xy to the sky," because the xylem tissue draws the water up from the bottom up to the top of the plant. So you think of it going up to the sky. Whereas the phloem is a living vascular tissue that carries sugar and organic substances throughout a plant. And so a little, memory helper is that the phloem has that F sound in the beginning, although it's spelled as a PH. But you think food, phloem, it both has the F sound. It carries the food, these sugar and other organic substance throughout a plant. All right, so let's look at On Your Own on page 431. It says, a gardener plants a group of flowers that grow beautifully over the course of a year. In order to have the same flowers each year, however, he must replant. So it's asking, are these most likely woody plants or herbaceous? So woody plants, again, would be like a tree. Herbaceous are the ones with the softer stem. It would definitely be the herbaceous. I believe this is pictures of impatiens, which have to be planted year after year. So let's look at 14.2. It says, a carrot is the root of a carrot plant. What kind of organ is it? So it's classified as a vegetative organ because, as they mentioned, it's the root. So this is the part, obviously, of the carrot they eat. Typically, we don't eat the greens, but I'm sure that maybe there are some people that do. All right, On Your Own 14.3, it says a section of plant no longer has any mitosis going on. What kind of tissues should be absent in that section? So, in that section it would be the meristematic tissue, because that's the area that has the most mitosis going on. And this is a figure that we'll be looking at a little bit later. But just to show you in this is the bottom of a root, the tip of a root. This is the meristematic tissue here, and that would be growing quite quickly, and that's where, as we mentioned, mitosis would be going on robustly. All right, so let's look at the macroscopic structure of a leaf. In this figure, which is figure 14.1 in your book, if you want to look in your book, we see that the blade is what's just called this primary portion of a leaf, the flat area. Then you have the apex. Here is the tip of the blade. That sort of each leaf has an area that has this apex. Then you have what's called the petiole. That's here, right? It's a small stalk that the blade is attached to. And then you have these stipules. See these tiny projections here? They sort of look like baby leaves. They're little stalk-like growths that cover the leaf when it first begins to grow. Then we can break down leaves into different categories. If you have a simple leaf, right, it has only one petiole attached to a stem. So if the stem of the plant's coming up this way, a simple leaf would have one petiole and then one leaf blade attached to that. If you have a compound leaf, then you have the stem here, and then you have a petiole branching off this way, and then you have numerous leaflets branching off of one petiole, and that would be considered a compound. And then we have different types of mosaics that they explain for leaves, right? It's alternate, so you can see it's a pattern along the stem of the leaf. So this was going right, left, that's an alternate pattern. Then you have opposite, where the petioles are directly opposite each other. And then finally you have this whorled pattern, where you have several of them attached right to the stem there. Sort of makes a flower pattern. Then leaves are typically classified by three different characteristics. By their shape, it's like their overall shape of the leaf. The margin, which we'll be looking at in detail, it's like the very, very edge of the leaf. And the venation, which is the pattern of the veins on the leaf. So let's look at those in a little more detail. All right, so we have linear. This, by the way, is figure 14.4 in your book, if you'd like to follow along in your book. But linear is the same width from the top to the bottom. This has a little bit of pointiness at the top and the bottom, but for the most part, it's pretty even across. Then we have the elliptical that has it's wide here, and then it's quite tapered at both the top and the bottom. The oval, they considered sort of an egg shape. Deltoid, which is a triangle. The chordate, which is an upside down heart. Orbicular, which is quite circular for the most part. Lobed, has some indentations in the shape of the leaf. The cleft has sharp, deep indentations. Then you have needle-like, which basically looks like needles. They're sharp and linear. And then finally, it's scale-like, which they describe looks like the scales of a fish. Now the margins on the leaf have to do with just the very edging on the outside. And so you may want to look in your book on 14.5 because it would show it in a little better detail. But the different types would be entire, which is actually just a smooth edge. The serrate, which have tiny sharp teeth around there. The dentate, which have pronounced teeth. That's connecting to dental, the word dental, or that root word. Then you have crenate, which has these rounded teeth on the outside. And then finally undulate, which is more of just a wavy border and no teeth. So it's quite a bit of variety there. Then on the venations, right, you have what are called, first you would identify the midrib, and that's a vein going up the center of the leaf, and it runs right from the petiole. So you have leaves that have parallel venation. That means that all the other veins run parallel to the midrib. You have what's called pinnate venation. The veins branch out off the midrib. And then finally the palmate, imagine like the palm of your hand. The veins branch out from, say, more from the bottom. There's some coming off the midrib, but there's quite a few coming out from the bottom of that too. And there's more, just to make a note on here, there's veins coming off the midrib. So there's numerous branches on the palmate. All right, so let's look at On Your Own 14.4 on page 435. It says, determine the shape, margin, and venation of these following leaves. So for A, we have the deltoid shape, a serrate margin, which they've sort of exaggerated here, and a pinnate venation. You can see it coming off the midrib there. Then on B, you have a lobed shape, an entire margin, that smooth margin around the outside, and a palmate venation. You can see the multiple branches coming off of there. And then on C, you have a cleft shape, the dentate margin, and a palmate venation. Once again, not vacation, but venation. All right, and then finally, letter D, it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but it's like a corn stalk. You have a linear shape, entire. They say it looks undulate, but it's just a little wrinkled around the edges. And then finally, it's parallel veins on letter D. All right, so let's look at the microscopic structure of a leaf. This is a slide that's a cross section of a leaf, and obviously the figures in your book. Once again, encourage you to look on because you'll see it in better detail. Oh, sorry about that. I got my notifications coming in. And so let's look at some of the different type of cells we have here. So we see the epidermis. This is the top of the leaf. It's this thin layer on this of cells on the top, and there's also a layer on the bottom here. And this is considered a dermal layer. So it's going to be the outside of the leaf is including the epidermis. Then the cuticle is a waxy substance secreted by the epidermis. I'm sure that you've felt on leaves this sort of plasticky texture. That's that waxy substance that's secreted by the epidermis. Then, importantly, the leaves have what are called stoma, or plural is stomata. They're holes on the underside of the leaf that help the gas to be exchanged. So this is pointing here to the entire stoma, and it has what's called these little red stained cells or guard cells. Those are cells on both sides of the stomata. They open and close, allowing gases to come in and out, and also be stopped at certain times of the day. They contain chlorophyll and produce specialized sugars. And as I mentioned, they shrink and swell to open or close that hole in the stomata there. And then we have parenchyma tissue, which is really interesting because it's the more of an ovaline shaped cell, that they're rich in chloroplasts and they're considered ground tissue. And because of the all the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts that's included in it, in the parenchymal tissue, they're responsible for a lot of photosynthesis. So the layers of parenchyma tissue here are considered both this palisade mesophyll. These are these cells that are tightly packed, and they have what is called cytoplasmic streaming. That's like this movement of the chloroplasts through them and it also makes this tightly packed layer of cells make the top of the leaf a darker green than the bottom. And then you have what's called the spongy mesophyll that is more porous, and the cells are packed loosely, so the gases can be exchanged as they come in through the stoma. Then they can permeate these different tissues. And then finally, we have the veins that have xylem, phloem, and parenchyma cells. I am looking on here. Here we go. So here we have our veins. And so this area is including the xylem, phloem, and parenchyma. All right, let's look at on your own 14.5. So it says a leaf cannot get the carbon dioxide that it needs for photosynthesis. What most likely is wrong? So in this case, we're concerned about the carbon dioxide permeating into the plant. And so one of the possibilities is that the stomata that are on the underside of the leaf are not opening, and that there's possibly a problem with the guard cells. I don't think that's very common, but it's just one way of understanding the function of them. Okay, 14.6. Why can't the parenchyma be made of 2 layers of the palisade mesophyll? So remember, the palisade mesophyll here is this tightly packed tissue. And the reason would be that if you didn't have this spongy mesophyll down here, if you had like 2 layers of this tightly packed tissue, then you wouldn't be able to have enough gas diffusion. You need to have some open spaces so the gases can permeate into the deeper tissues of the leaf. All right, and now on 14.7, it reads, in the first section of this module, you learned about the 4 basic tissues in a plant: dermal, ground, meristematic, and vascular. In this section, you learned about the epidermis, parenchyma, and parenchyma. Classify each of these within the 4 basic tissue types. So we know epidermis is dermal tissue. It's on the outside. The parenchyma and the parenchyma are both considered ground tissue. And they all have an important and distinct function in the plants. Okay, so let's look at leaf color. We know chlorophyll is a pigment that gives a green color to leaves, and it also is essential for photosynthesis. And we know that plastids are these sort of little capsules that contain pigments, starches, and oils. You may remember when we looked at slides of banana, that we were looking at the starch granules in the banana cells, and those were contained in certain types of plastids. So some other important housings for pigments are, other important pigments that are housed are carotenoids. These are pigments with yellow or orange color, and the anthocyanins, which are pigments that vary in color based on the pH of the leaf. So, I'm wondering if I'm hitting my spot where I'm supposed to stop. So give me 1 second here. Yes, so I'm going to stop at this point, and in the next video I will pick up the information on deciduous plants.